Let me start by thanking you all for being here. And when I say that it's a real honour and that I appreciate it, I'm not exaggerating. I also want to thank colleagues in the events department without whose work this evening wouldn't have happened, and to dedicate this lecture to 4 people no longer alive: my parents, Božena, Helmut, and to my friends Graham Burton Laker and Elizabeth Kingdom. I need also to mention at least some of the other people from my past without whom I would not be standing here today. The head of my infant school, Mrs. Phillips. The wonderful Mr. Madison, who taught me at primary school and who had to put up with me. 3 of my secondary school teachers, Denby, Lockwood, Lucas, and less formally, now that we've got to the end of the 60s, and that's a giveaway, of course, Ray Farrer, who taught me how to teach. And then to my teachers at Kent, Larry, Richard, Tony, Sean, and especially Chris. My colleagues here at Brighton, whether teachers, students, or administrators. Your integrity and your resourcefulness, and above all your solidarity and friendship, have sustained and supported me over the years. I'm not going to embarrass you with names, that's for later. But thanks too, of course, to all my friends and colleagues elsewhere, whether here today or not. Your friendship and support is no less important. So, philosophy. It's very odd to talk about the value of philosophy when half the present cabinet have degrees in philosophy, politics and economics from the University of Oxford. It looks like an uphill task. After all, if that's what philosophy does for you, it's not a very good advert. Still, I'll try, and I'll try to show you that we're not all in the same yacht. So, because philosophers, as my colleagues here in Brighton very well know, always do things in threes, I'm going to talk about 3 things this evening. About knowledge and belief, about how philosophy, abstract though it is nevertheless practical in as much as it can help us see that something is or is not true, and therefore what we should do about it. And as an example of philosophy's practicality, I'm going to say just a very little bit about capitalism and why it's immoral. And lastly, and as importantly as anything else, since philosophy is nothing if not conversation, we'll continue less formally over a few drinks. So, knowing and believing. Well, the first philosophical question I can really remember getting excited about was this: can we ever tell the difference between what we merely believe, or what we think we know, and what we really do know? And I'm still excited by this question because it matters so much. An example, if someone tells you they listen to God every morning for instructions, can you know that they don't in fact know what they think they know? Can you know that they only believe it because it's not true, and only what's true can be known? Or if someone's convinced that, say, Palestinian people, or Jewish or black people, or women, are in some ways inferior to white men, can you know that they're wrong? Not in order to convince them, of course. That's all too unlikely. And anyway, there are far more important things to do with our time than trying to convince idiots. But rather to convince yourself that your judgment is actually right, and that you're therefore right when you act on that judgment. Because, of course, if you don't know that what racists believe is, as a matter of fact, wrong, you can't in turn know that you're right to fight racism. And that matters. It matters a lot. Now, of course, this isn't to say that we can always distinguish between what's known and what's only believed. An example might be, say, abortion, thought by many to be a paradigmatic moral dilemma. Do we know, or do we only believe whatever it is that we take the fetus to be in relation to persons? I don't think the answer's just obvious. There are problems here whichever way you go. And maybe it's not clear how to resolve them. That's why you might think it's a dilemma. But of course, it's a mistake to suppose that somehow morality is peculiarly susceptible to dilemmas. Dilemmas are commonplace in ordinary empirical matters too. Do you know, or do you merely believe that you should turn left at the next fork in the path? It could equally well, or badly, be either. Do you know, or do you merely believe that the risks of nuclear power outweigh its benefits, or vice versa? Nor, and this is important, does making this distinction between knowledge and belief suggest that we're infallible when we make it, however confident we might be. For instance, I know there's no life after death. But I also know that my knowledge, like everybody else's, is fallible, the Pope notwithstanding. Because what looks like knowledge often turns out only to have been belief. People once quite reasonably thought the earth was flat. We know it isn't, don't we? Hope we do. But that's, of course, because we now know more than they knew then. If we go back to morality, some philosophers, notoriously Aristotle, accepted slavery, thinking they knew what it turns out they only believed. Others, notoriously Kant, as some of you know, my hero, thought that women were not the equal of men, thinking they knew, but they didn't. They turn out to have only believed because it wasn't true. But that we can always turn out to be mistaken about what we think we know doesn't imply that the distinction between knowledge and belief is itself, after all, hazy or impossible. Quite the opposite. It's relativism, the view very broadly and roughly that there's no cross-cultural knowledge, so that different beliefs are all we have. It's relativism that has a hard time making sense of fallibility. And here's why. The distinction between knowledge and belief is clear enough. But people aren't always in a position to see it. But it's not that people who thought, for instance, that combustible things burn by giving off phlogiston were stupid or inattentive or somehow blameworthy. It's just that they didn't know about oxygen. They were simply mistaken. But what matters here is that the very idea of being mistaken requires exactly the distinction between knowing and believing that I'm talking about. If there really were no difference between knowing something and believing it, if knowing was just a very strong believing, which is basically what relativism claims, then there could be no question of being mistaken. Now that might sound odd, but I don't think it is. If we didn't know that the Earth was not flat, then we couldn't regard thinking that the Earth is flat as a mistake, but only as an alternative to the belief that it's roughly a globe. Again, mistakes are one of the things that makes it possible to distinguish knowing from believing. And the reality of mistakes shows that the distinction between knowing and believing holds, however fallibly.